I'm definitely going to die. If these hornets get me in the face, please bury me with my sunglasses on. Ma'am, stop thrashing. You're making them more aggressive. What part of swarming hornets is confusing to you? The forest erupted with chaotic sounds, branches snapping, wings buzzing furiously, and a woman's panicked voice rising above it all like a soprano hitting her highest note. She tumbled down the hillside, arms windmilling wildly, her copper hair plastered to her sweat-drenched face, designer jeans torn at the knees, and her cream blouse clinging to her back like wet tissue paper. Before we continue with today's story, if you're enjoying what you've heard so far, please hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps me keep sharing these inspiring tales that touch your day. Thank you for your support. Behind her, an angry cloud of hornets swirled and dove in relentless pursuit. Mason Reed froze in disbelief, standing about 30 feet away with an armful of kindling and an expression of utter bewilderment. He'd encountered deer, coyotes, and once even a mountain lion in these woods. But this was unprecedented. "Over here," he shouted, dropping the firewood. He yanked a smoldering branch from his campfire and grabbed a damp cloth. "Get behind me. The smoke will drive them away." The woman needed no further prompting. She stumbled forward, tripping over an exposed root before collapsing behind him. Mason swung the smoking branch in broad arcs, creating a thick haze between them and the hornets. The insects hovered, agitated, then gradually scattered, their angry buzz fading into the distance. The woman groaned from her position on the ground. "Please tell me my face is still attached to my body." "Your face is intact," Mason replied. "Somewhat puffier than usual, I imagine, but definitely still there." She cracked open one eye. "That's actually the nicest thing anyone said to me today." "Rough morning. You have absolutely no idea." Mason helped her to her feet and guided her toward his small timber cabin nestled among towering pines. He led her to a bench fashioned from reclaimed wood and soft blankets near the wood stove. Her hands trembled visibly. Angry crimson welts were spreading across her cheeks, arms, and neck. One eye was swelling shut, and her bottom lip was nearly twice its normal size. "I've got something for those stings," Mason said, moving through the cabin with the comfortable familiarity of someone accustomed to solitude. He returned with a jar of thick, greenish salve and a pair of tweezers. "I need to remove the stingers first. This might hurt a bit. Go ahead. At this point, I'll let you shave my eyebrows if it would help." He knelt beside her and worked carefully, gently extracting each stinger. She winced occasionally, but remained stoically silent. When he paused at a string near her collarbone, she noticed his hesitation. "This next one's in delicate territory," he said. "May I?" She rolled her swollen eyes, though a hint of amusement played at the corners of her mouth. "If you touch anything inappropriate, I'll personally reintroduce you to those hornets." Noted, he worked with careful precision, though he couldn't help but be aware of her proximity. Even swollen and injured, there was something magnetic about her presence. He applied the salve to a sting along her ribcage, and she inhaled sharply. "Sorry," he murmured. "No, it's fine. I just never expected to meet a stranger by fleeing through a forest with insects trying to execute me." "Well," he replied with a slight smirk, "it's certainly a memorable introduction. You're not so bad yourself, rescuing damsels with smoke signals and mystery ointments. Do you save screaming women often?" "Only before lunch. Lucky timing for me." He finished treating her stings and offered her a glass of cool water. "Drink this. You're probably dehydrated." She accepted it gratefully, sipped cautiously, then placed it on the small table beside her. "Thank you. Seriously, I owe you one." Mason sat across from her on a handcrafted stool, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "So, what were you running from?" Her shoulders stiffened noticeably. The brief levity vanished from her face. Then, with a slow exhale, she leaned back and closed her eyes. "Something worse than hornets," she finally answered. "Expectations." Mason didn't press further. He nodded as if her cryptic response made perfect sense. She studied him through a less swollen eye. "You're not going to ask what that means?" "Nope. Why not?" He shifted slightly. "You'll tell me if you want to. If you don't, that's fine too. Either way, I've already seen you face down in the dirt screaming about your facial features. I think we're past the formalities." She chuckled despite herself. "You're strange." "I like it." "Good," he replied, "because I'm completely out of normal." They sat in comfortable silence, interrupted only by the distant hum of hornets far beyond the cabin and the gentle whisper of wine through the pines. Despite the welts, The pain and the absurdity of her situation, the woman felt something unfamiliar settle over her. Tranquility. It had hurt like hell to find it, but perhaps the swarm had led her exactly where she needed to be. By morning, the swelling had subsided slightly, but Maya, the name she'd offered with a casual shrug, was still a constellation of bumps, bruises, and acerbic commentary. She hobbled between the bed and the porch with a walking stick Mason had carved from pine, moving like a disgruntled hiker with blisters. "Remind me never to antagonize Mother Nature again," she groaned, collapsing into an Adirondack chair on the cabin's porch. From inside, where he was stirring a pot of something aromatic on a vintage wood-burning stove, Mason called out, "Nature's fine. You just antagonized the hornets." She snorted. "Same difference. Flying devils with attitude problems." He emerged carrying a bowl of steaming oatmeal, sprinkled with wild berries. "Eat this. Unless you're planning to faint dramatically and make me carry you again." "I might fake it," she replied, accepting the bowl, "just to see how far you get before your back gives out." "You're far more entertaining when medicated," he observed dryly. She smiled over her breakfast. "Only slightly more charming than when I'm swollen and terrifying." Later that afternoon, he washed her torn blouse and hung it on a cedar branch near the cabin. When she limped outside and saw it fluttering in the mountain breeze like a surrender flag, she gave him a sardonic look. "My superhero cape? Hornet woman to the rescue." Mason smirked. "Shut up, or I'll sting you myself." They both laughed, and the silence that followed felt unexpectedly comfortable. She stayed. One day became 2, then 3. Mason asked no questions. Not about her name, not about the designer label visible inside her muddied hiking boots, not about the flash of fear that crossed her face whenever she heard a helicopter overhead. In return, Maya offered fragments of herself, carefully disguised as jokes and wrapped in self-deprecation. "Let's just say," she remarked one evening as they sat beneath a tapestry of stars, "I was heading toward a life that looked flawless in photographs, but felt like slow suffocation." Mason raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominously poetic." "It was," she replied with a wistful smile. "A destination filled with champagne flutes, monogrammed napkins, and a distinct feeling of drowning in silk." He didn't press further. Instead, he offered her another marshmallow from a bag he reserved for special occasions. They roasted them on whittled sticks over a small fire pit. She dropped hers into the flames 3 times before successfully eating one. "I'm not outdoorsy," she declared, chewing thoughtfully. "I appreciate luxury. If this is my woodland exile, at least give me a decent pillow. I gave you my best one. It's filled with crunchy mysteries." He laughed. "That's natural stuffing. Builds character." On the 4th evening, Maya stood before the small, cracked mirror hanging on the cabin wall near the basin. She leaned close, examining her reflection. One eye still carried a yellowish bruise. Her lips were healing. Her cheek, once grotesquely swollen, now displayed only a faint pinkish hue. Her usually styled hair hung in natural waves around her face. She touched her jaw with tentative fingers and released a long, trembling breath. Mason passed by the open door, but paused when he heard her whispered words. "For once," she murmured, "I'm not beautiful, and yet I don't hate what I see." She hadn't intended to speak aloud. Mason didn't enter the room. He simply stood with his back to her, gazing toward the horizon. "You're not defined by your appearance, Maya," he said gently. "And you were never more beautiful than the moment you stopped trying to be." She didn't respond, but when she emerged minutes later, she sat beside him on the porch without speaking. They watched the forest sway in the twilight breeze. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing, and he wasn't rescuing. They were simply 2 people, sting-marked, sunburned, and slightly broken, sharing a moment beneath an indifferent sky. The knock came around noon. Mason wiped his hands on a kitchen towel and opened the cabin door to find a delivery driver holding a cardboard package and squinting at his GPS. "Reed?" the man asked. "Mason Reed, that's me." The driver handed over the package, then peered curiously into the cabin, his eyes narrowing. "Whoa, sorry to stare, but she looks just like—" Mason's voice dropped, firm but polite. "She's recovering. That's all you need to know." The driver shrugged. "Hey, none of my business. Just, she really resembles that heiress. You know, the runaway bride, Elise Montgomery? Been all over the news this past week." Mason stiffened slightly but nodded. "Thanks. Drive carefully." The truck rumbled away down the dirt road. Inside, Maya, or not Maya, stood by the sink drying a tin cup. Her focused eyes belied her trembling hands. She had heard every word. Mason stepped inside, gently closed the door behind him, and leaned against the frame. Planning to tell me before CNN does? She froze. The silence between them grew thick and uncertain. Then she sighed, carefully set down the cup, and turned to face him. My name isn't Maya, she said softly. It's Elise. Elise Montgomery. Mason remained motionless, his expression carefully neutral. She continued as if a dam had broken. I'm the daughter of Victor Montgomery. Yes, the Montgomery. The resorts, the real estate empire, the carefully crafted press statements. I was supposed to marry last Saturday, a wedding with 500 guests, crystal chandeliers imported from Venice, and a chamber orchestra. All meticulously planned months ago. All for the brand. She laughed bitterly. The only things missing were love, and, apparently, me. Mason crossed his arms, his tone measured. So you ran. I ran, she confirmed, her voice cracking. I ran in the only direction that didn't reek of roses and publicists. Mason studied her for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly. Well, he said, you do have privileged handwriting. The way you labeled your toiletries gave you away. Elise blinked, then snorted with unexpected laughter. Seriously? You color-coordinated them with little tags. They were limited edition travel sizes, she said defensively. He raised his hands in surrender. No, yeah, you meant. Just an observation. Maya, never quite fit, but I enjoyed being her while it lasted. She was fearless. Didn't know anyone anything. Elise smiled sadly. I wanted to be her. Maya was free. Mason moved to the table and sat down. So what now? She joined him, folding her hands on the worn wooden surface. I don't know. I didn't plan that far ahead. I just needed out. Mason nodded slowly. Then stay out. Or stay here. Or go wherever feels authentic. She looked at him, confused. You're not angry? He raised an eyebrow. You lied about your name, not about who you are. You never asked for special treatment. Never played helpless. You helped around here, even when you looked like a pufferfish. She laughed, tears forming in her eyes. He leaned forward, forearms on the table. You didn't arrive as Elise Montgomery. You came as someone who needed space to breathe, and I respect that. Her lip quivered slightly. You're the only man I've ever met who didn't try to fix me or possess me. You just listened. He shrugged. Not my job to fix you. I'm not a renovation specialist. Still, she said quietly, thank you for not making me explain my worth. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out over the clearing. You're welcome to stay, Elise. Or Maya. Or whoever you feel like being tomorrow. She joined him, still limping faintly. Can I be both? He glanced at her and smiled. You already are. Outside, the pines swayed gently in the afternoon light. Somewhere in the distance, hornets hummed over wildflowers. Inside the rustic cabin, two people stood quietly, without labels or expectations, just a woman and a man contemplating what came next. Elise had never used cast iron before. She'd seen such pans in specialty stores, perhaps displayed in a staged kitchen during a photo shoot. But cooking with one over an actual fire, that was entirely new. I may have slightly misjudged the timing, she muttered, watching eggs burn into a fossilized mass at the bottom of the pan. Mason poked his head in from the porch. Smells like determination. She groaned. Don't you dare say anything clever. I will introduce this pan to your skull. He entered, glanced at the char breakfast, and said nothing. He simply reached for 2 plates and scraped the edible portions onto each. She narrowed her eyes at him. You're actually going to eat that? Wouldn't miss it. Scorched eggs are a delicacy if you squint hard enough. She sat across from him, arms crossed, watching as he took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded. You lied, she accused. About what? You said it was edible. Your expression says otherwise. He grinned, eyes crinkling at the corners. It says I value the effort more than the flavor. The next day, they painted the cabin's front railing together. Mason handed her a brush already dipped in faded blue-gray. It's not the trendiest shade, but it deters hornets from nesting in the wood grain. Elise accepted it with a mock curtsy. A practical princess at last. By late afternoon, they were sunburned and paint spattered, and the railing looked charmingly imperfect. I call this section abstract perseverance, she said, pointing to her uneven brushstrokes. He indicated a spot where he'd accidentally leaned against wet paint. This is my contribution, man versus gravity. Then came the honey incident. Elise, overly confident in her ability to reorganize Mason's pantry shelves, accidentally knocked over a large jar of wild honey. It shattered on the floor, unleashing a sticky amber flood that immediately attracted several curious scout hornets. "Mason," she called, backing away with exaggerated slowness. "I may have, created a situation." He turned just in time to see her bolt past the door, 3 determined hornets in pursuit, arms flailing exactly as they had on the day they met. He sprinted after her, laughing. "We've come full circle, haven't we? If they sting my backside again, I'm moving to Antarctica." He grabbed a dish towel and waved it above her, guiding her back into the cabin. He slammed the door behind them, both collapsing into breathless laughter. "No more honey handling for you," he gasped. "No more trusting me with gravity-sensitive objects," she agreed. Later, when the chaos had settled and the sun dipped low behind the mountains, they sat on the porch again. The air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, their arms lightly touching, the silence between them rich with unspoken possibilities. Sometimes her fingers brushed against his, sometimes their gazes met and lingered. One night, their faces drifted closer without conscious intent. Her breath caught. His hand moved gently to her cheek. She closed her eyes. Just before their lips met, a branch snapped loudly in the forest. They jolted apart like startled deer. Elise pressed a hand to her chest. "Oh God, I think my heart just attempted an escape." Mason, equally flustered, rubbed the back of his neck. "That was nearly—" They laughed too loudly and too quickly, each looking in opposite directions. That night, as they sat beside the fire in companionable silence, the stars scattered across the black canvas of sky like secrets only they were permitted to hear. Elise tilted her head back and closed her eyes. "If this is life without luxury," she whispered, "why does it feel fuller than anything I've ever experienced?" Mason didn't answer immediately. He simply reached over, took her hand, and held it without a word. "Because sometimes fullness has nothing to do with possessions," he finally said. "It's about who remains beside you after the hornets have gone." It began with tire tracks. Mason noticed them first, deep, artificial grooves in the soft earth near the trailhead. They cut through the soil like the heavy treads of something built for urban streets, not mountain paths. Not wildlife, not hikers. These were luxury SUV tracks, corporate black or wealth black. He crouched beside them, fingers tracing the edge of one impression. Fresh, heavy. Wrong. Elise had just finished hanging laundry behind the cabin when she saw his expression. "Company?" she asked, her heart stuttering. Mason rose slowly, jaw tightening. He didn't need to answer. They both knew. An hour later, the forest no longer whispered. It rumbled. Engines, powerful and deliberate, wound through the trees like predators. Then 3 vehicles emerged into the clearing. Sleek, obsidian, windows tinted to opacity. They halted just short of the cabin with the calculated precision of those accustomed to controlling every environment they entered. 2 men stepped out first, security in tailored suits that looked absurdly formal against the wilderness backdrop. Then a third figure emerged, taller, sharper, radiating authority. The atmosphere seemed to chill around him. His calculating gaze swept the property, cataloging every detail. The weathered cabin, the handmade furniture on the porch, a row of wildflowers growing in repurposed hiking boots, before finally settling on Elise. She stood frozen, fingers digging into her palms. "Father." Victor Montgomery removed his designer sunglasses with the practiced flourish of someone accustomed to cameras. His expression conveyed absolute control without a trace of warmth. "There you are," he said, voice smooth as polished marble. "Enjoying your little rustic fantasy?" Behind him, 3 more men appeared, attorneys with leather portfolios and the polite, practiced demeanor of people who had dismantled lives over expensive coffee. Mason stepped forward from the porch, calm and resolute, a man built from timber and resilience. "Afternoon," he said with deceptive cordiality. Victor barely acknowledged him. "You must be the mountain man." Mason extended a hand. "Mason Reed, conservationist, hornet negotiator, professional pancake burner." Victor ignored the gesture, turning back to his daughter. "You've made your point, Elise. The theatrical rebellion is over. It's time to return home." Elise's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not going back." "This," Victor gestured dismissively at the cabin. "This is your grand plan? A shack with questionable plumbing." Mason smiled faintly. "No plumbing, actually. Rainwater collection system, gravity-fed." "You don't get to speak," Victor snapped, turning toward him. "You've been harboring my daughter under false pretenses. This borders on abduction." "She fled," Mason replied evenly. I simply didn't slam the door at her face. Elise stepped forward. You didn't force me to stay. You forced me to leave. The lead attorney adjusted his glasses. If Ms. Montgomery does not return voluntarily, Mr. Reed could face charges of obstruction, unlawful detention, and interference with a contractual obligation. Mason blinked. Did you just refer to her as a contract? Victor's voice hardened. You think this is about sentiment? About feelings? This is about legacy. That wedding represented over $2 billion in strategic partnerships. You think your little wildflower garden is worth that price? Elise's hands clenched into fists. At least the wildflowers aren't transactional. Victor advanced menacingly. This is your final opportunity, Elise. Come with us now, or we'll have you removed. You can sign the necessary documents in the car if you insist on being dramatic. One of the security personnel stepped forward. Mason moved instinctively, solid and protective. He positioned himself between them. She's not captive here, he said, voice low and certain. But I won't be the reason she loses her freedom. The security guard wasn't interested in philosophy. He shoved Mason hard. Mason stumbled backward, but maintained his balance. The second push came with a closed fist, connecting with Mason's jaw with a sickening crack. Elise screamed. Mason hit the ground, dazed and bleeding but conscious. That's enough, Elise cried, rushing to his side. She dropped to her knees, hands trembling as they cradled his face. Victor raised a hand. Take her. But she didn't move. Instead, she wrapped her arms around Mason and held him as if he were the only authentic thing in a world of staged realities and legal disclaimers. Through tears and bruises and shattered illusions, she whispered, You're the only thing I want to run toward, not away from. Mason looked up at her, a split lip forming a crooked smile. Well, he rasped, that's one way to make a declaration. Even the attorneys paused. The security personnel shifted uncomfortably. Victor stood speechless, his silence more threatening than any verbal assault. Elise rose, shaking but resolute. You can have your empire, your mergers, your public image. But you can't have me unless I choose to be yours. And I'm not your property to trade away. And then, for the first time in her life, she turned her back on everything she was expected to be and walked directly into the arms of the man who had only ever asked her to be exactly who she already was. The morning after everything unraveled, the cabin felt unnaturally quiet. Mason brewed coffee as he always did, methodical, unhurried, intentional. But the silence, where her footsteps usually padded, where her sarcastic morning grumbles usually resonated, enveloped him like a bruise. Elise sat on the porch, wrapped in the oversized flannel shirt she'd claimed from his closet. Her eyes were puffy, her hair loosely braided, still faintly scented with pine soap and wood smoke. He joined her, offering one of 2 steaming mugs. She accepted without speaking. The silence between them was no longer comforting. It felt final. I can't stay, she said at last, her voice barely audible. They'll return. With media next time, with legal orders, with chaos. And it will be your sanctuary, your life that gets destroyed. Mason gazed at the tree line. I'm not concerned. I am, she replied. I care too much. Enough to leave. He turned to her, eyes tired but gentle. You're not protecting me. You're punishing yourself. She shook her head. No, I'm giving myself a chance to discover who I am without someone else trying to define me. They sat together, sipping in silence. The warmth of the coffee provided little defense against the chill creeping into their hearts. Mason disappeared briefly into the cabin and returned with a small glass jar. The first harvest of spring honey, rich, golden, and simply labeled. He pressed it into her palm. To remind you of sweetness, he said. After a pause, he added, and stings. Her lips trembled. You always manage to make things hurt and heal simultaneously. Occupational hazard, he replied with a fragile smile. She didn't embrace him. He didn't beg her to stay. They simply stood looking at each other, as if the story they had written on bark and bruise and brushstroke would forever be imprinted on their souls. Then she turned, and the sound of her boots on the gravel path became the most deafening thing he had ever heard. 3 days later, Mason powered up the small solar radio he used during severe weather warnings. This time, the storm was emotional. Elise Montgomery, sole heir to the Montgomery Global Holdings, announced this morning in a live broadcast her decision to relinquish her claim to the family fortune. The newscaster reported. His voice faded beneath Elise's own. On screen, she wore no makeup, no designer attire. Just that same flannel shirt she had refused to return. I've spent my entire life being groomed for an existence I never chose, she stated, her voice steady. I won't participate in a system where love is traded like currency. I'm not making a political statement. I'm simply stepping away from the machinery. Later that evening, Mason discovered a letter tucked beneath his doormat. The envelope was smudged with dirt, his name written in elegant, flowing script. Inside, Mason, you taught me authenticity. You didn't rescue me. You created space for me to rescue myself. I can't articulate everything I'm feeling because language lacks words for this particular ache. But know this, I'm not running from you. I'm running toward the woman you recognized in me. And someday, when I've become her fully, I hope to find you again. Still in that flannel, still brewing terrible coffee, still real. Mason folded the letter gently and placed it in the same jar where he kept wildflower seeds, because some things don't bloom until much, much later. The morning mist rolled in low and thick, curling around the trees like a protective embrace. It settled over the cabin steps, spread across the clearing, and blanketed the surrounding hills in a hush so profound it felt sacred. The world wasn't speaking today. It was whispering. Mason moved through his kitchen with the rhythm of habit. He didn't rush. He measured the water precisely as always, letting it heat just beyond a simmer before pouring it over the coarse coffee grounds in the battered metal filter. The aroma rose with quiet dignity, like something ancient and true. Outside, the porch creaked, not from a wind, from weight. Footsteps. Familiar footsteps. Mason's hand paused mid-pour. The stream of hot water slowed, then stopped. He listened. Then, clear, teasing, and unmistakably hers, a voice floated through the mist. Is this seat taken, or do I have to negotiate with the chipmunks for it? Mason turned slowly, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and the speaking of her name, his fingers tightening around the mug. There she stood. Elise. No makeup, no designer clothes, no Montgomery polish or practice posture. Just a soft gray sweater that looked lived in. Jeans with genuine wear at the knees. And that braid, loose and imperfect, swayed gently with each step she took toward him. Yet in all that unpolished simplicity, she had never appeared more composed. He opened the screen door cautiously, almost afraid the vision would dissolve if he moved too quickly. She stepped onto the porch as if she had never left. Her boots brushed against the same floorboards she had once helped paint. Her eyes took in each detail, her uneven brushstrokes on the railing, the small hornet carving they'd joked about, the half-empty jar of honey still catching sunlight on the windowsill. Coffee still terrible, she asked softly. Worse, he replied, his throat tight with emotion. She smiled. Not for effect, not strategically, just because. He handed her a mug. Their fingers met, and in that brief, accidental touch, every day apart felt like a string pulled taut, then gently released. The tension didn't vanish, but it softened. They sat on the porch swing, shoulders touching. The mist enveloped them like a blanket woven from the forest itself. The only sounds were the gentle creak of wood, the whisper of a distant breeze, and the questioning chatter of a chipmunk who clearly remembered her. I thought about sending another letter, she said after a while. Or maybe a postcard, perhaps even a dramatic video message with orchestral background music, but none of it felt authentic. Not anymore. He didn't look at her, just nodded once, deliberately. So I came back, she finished. A pause, then he glanced sideways. Because, she exhaled slowly. Because I ran, I healed, I even tried to forget, but nothing ever felt like home until this porch. And you. Mason didn't speak immediately. His jaw worked silently, his gaze fixed on the hills, gradually emerging from the mist. You figured everything out? He finally asked. She laughed softly. Not even close. But I've figured out enough to know where I want to be while I continue discovering. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind that exists only after everything essential has been said, and repeating it would merely create echoes. Finally, he cleared his throat. So what now? Elise sipped the coffee, then grimaced. Still tastes like burnt optimism. He grinned. I never promised good coffee. Just consistent disappointment. She turned toward him, her expression softening. The playfulness receded. What now is? I like to stay. Not as a visitor, not as a narrative that fled, just as I. The woman who chose to return, who finally wants to stop running. He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw neither headlines nor inheritances. He saw neither scandal nor escape. He saw Maya. He saw Elise. He saw a woman who had once screamed about hornets and now wanted to plant lavender where she once hid. He smiled just slightly. The chair's still warm. You never really left. She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and rested her head against his shoulder. The mist was lifting now, dissolving at the edges, and with it, the weight of everything they had left unspoken. The world wasn't whispering anymore. It was waiting. 1 year later, the cabin wasn't merely a cabin anymore. The porch had been expanded. Flower boxes hung beneath windows, overflowing with wild lupin and sage. The once uneven path had been lined with stones, each painted by visitors who arrived and departed with more than just luggage. They brought stories, scars, and the gradual, tender hope for something genuine. Above the entrance gate, a hand-carved wooden sign read, Stillwater Haven, a place for the lost to land. It had become a retreat, a quiet sanctuary nestled among the mountains where people came to breathe, to disconnect, to remember how to laugh authentically again. They planted herbs. They learned to bake bread over open flames. They helped tend the honeybees, and in the process discovered they feared stings less than they feared invisibility. Elise conducted workshops on journaling for healing, using her own journey as a foundation. Her memoir, The Heiress Who Found Herself, had resonated widely, not because it was sensational, but because it was genuine. Mason, meanwhile, led slow living immersions, teaching city dwellers how to identify edible plants, predict weather patterns, and, his most controversial advice, exist for an entire day without checking their phones. They'd even appeared on a podcast together. Mason had contributed exactly 4 sentences. Elise had provided the rest, proudly declaring him the only person who could make honey seem philosophical. But at night, after the last retreat participant retired to their cabin, after the wildlife settled into their nocturnal routines, and after the sky expanded with infinite stars, the place returned to simply being home. On one such evening, with the moon hanging low and the crickets providing background melody, Elise curled into Mason's lap on the porch swing. Their legs intertwined beneath a hand-woven blanket. She wore one of his shirts and smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. He rested his chin atop her head. Tired? Not really, she whispered. Just content, which is terrifying. Mason laughed softly. That's the most Elise answer I've ever heard. She nudged his ribs gently. Want to hear a line I almost included in the book, but thought was too sentimental? Absolutely. She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. Hornets sting. Love heals. But both remain faithful to their sanctuary. Mason considered this, then smiled. That's not sentimental. That's perfect. Well, she said, leaning closer, let me give you something sweeter. Their kiss was gentle, familiar, like the final page of a story you never want to conclude. From inside the cabin, a lamp flickered on. Mom, came a sleepy voice. Mason stood slowly, lifting Elise with him as if they'd choreographed the movement 1,000 times. She brushed her hair from her face and turned toward the door. Coming, sweetheart. Their daughter, 5 years old with curious eyes and a fearless spirit, her mother had only recently discovered in herself, sometimes had nightmares. Each time, Elise would go to her with a spoonful of honey and whisper, even the bravest explorers get scared sometimes. Later, when their daughter had drifted back to sleep, they walked hand in hand through the lavender garden. The sky was lighting at the edges, dawn approaching with its promises. New retreat-goers would arrive tomorrow. New stories would unfold. New reminders that love wasn't born from running or staying, but from choosing, again and again. At the edge of the wildflower meadow, Mason stopped, pulled Elise close, and kissed her forehead. She smiled up at him. We're an unconventional little sanctuary, she said softly. And yet, he whispered against her hair, I'd never want to belong anywhere else. Together, with their child dreaming between them and the horizon stretching before them, they walked slowly toward the warmth of a home that had chosen them as much as they had chosen it. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey, a story that began with a swarm of hornets and culminated in something infinitely sweeter, a love that healed, a home that welcomed return, and a woman who finally became herself. If this story touched your heart, brought a smile to your face, or perhaps drew a tear to your eye, remember that even life's most painful stings can lead us to our sweetest destinations, if we have the courage to follow where they lead.